we want to talk about now is Africa. So we've got Persia, Ethiopia and Libya. Now what's going on in Africa, we know there's been a lot of turmoil and trouble in Africa growing. You remember that we had the Arab Spring a decade or so ago, when Arab countries had a lot of revolutionary activity and new rulers and military rulers taking charge. And the question now is, are we now seeing the African Spring? Are the African countries now going through a lot of turmoil which will result in new leadership, particularly military coups taking place? Why would Africa be important to Russia? Is an interesting question. The answer is this. First of all, it has 54 countries in the continent of Africa. That's more countries in any continent than any other continent. There are many, many of them there, and it's a large population that we don't hear a lot about. But they've got 54 countries out of 193 in the United Nations, which means in the General Assembly vote in the United Nations, if they all voted together, 54 out of 193 are voting in favour of whoever they are in league with. And Russia is now making sure that they're in league with Russia. So if a vote needs to go through to the advantage of Russia, then they could count on the support of the vast majority of the countries of Africa. Small though they are, some countries there are less than 1 million people, but they've got one vote in the United Nations. China, 1.4 billion, India, 1.4 billion, one vote each. So all these countries can be a big force politically in the world if they're on side with Russia. Now, they also have 40% of the world's gold. Huge, very, very wealthy as far as gold is concerned, mainly still in the ground, that can be mined and exploited. They are the largest reserves of cobalt, of diamonds, of platinum and of uranium. And just interestingly, the trouble that's going on right now in Niger, if you want to pronounce it the French way, it's Niger. In Niger, there are huge reserves of uranium being mined already for France, which has got 56 nuclear power plants. We're worried about maybe putting one in Australia sometime or other. They've got 56 in the little country of France already, nuclear plants. And those nuclear plants actually, 3 out of 4 every lights in France is lit by nuclear power. So they're very, very dependent on nuclear power, and most of the uranium, 3/4 of it, comes from Niger. So do you think France wants to hold on to Niger? It certainly does, but it doesn't look like it's going to, because Russia is acting behind the scenes to destabilise, and Mr. Putin is very clever at doing that. Now, how important is Africa? This is the Ethiopia and Libya of Bible prophecy to Russia. Well, Russia in 2019 held the first Russian-African summit in Sochi, paid all the fares for all the people to go over from Africa. 40 of the 54 African states were represented by the heads of state. 6,000 delegates behind the scenes doing deals amongst each other and with Russia. And the key outcomes were that Russia forgave a lot of the debt that Africa owed to Russia for providing infrastructure or food or weapons, whatever, forgave the debt of most of those countries in exchange for an agreement that they will buy their weapons from Russia in future and become more and more dependent upon Russia. New trade agreements as well. So that was a big start, a big turnaround, because Russia saw an opening there in Africa. And then they held their second summit only last month in St. Petersburg. So first of all they go to Sochi, where the Winter Olympics had been held, were fated there. Now they go to St. Petersburg and look at the the richness of the surroundings there. How do those African leaders feel? Very, very important, thank you, Mr. Putin. Well, he, on his last occasion, only a month ago, he told the African leaders, one problem you've got is food. We're going to give you 25,000 up to 50,000 tonnes of grain, because they're a little bit concerned because they're not getting grain out of Ukraine now because of the boycott on the export of grain in the Black Sea from Ukraine. We're going to give you this grain to Burkina Faso, Zimbabwe, Mali, Somalia, Eritrea, Central African Republic, In the next 3 or 4 months we're going to send it, and it's going to be free delivery, straight to your door. So Moscow has written off, he says Mr. Putin, we've written off $23 billion of your debt, as long as you could buy weapons from us in the future. And more than that, Egypt was fated as one of the wealthiest countries in Africa, and the president of Egypt, President El-Sisi, was a joint chairman of the conference that was held over there with Mr. Putin. Russia's building Egypt's first nuclear power plant, and Egypt has a third of Russia's trade with Africa. So Egypt's very, very important. We know from the Bible, Daniel chapter 11, that Russia is going to come down into Egypt first to control its treasures. That's going to happen, and that's going to happen very soon. Now, when we talk about Libya and Ethiopia here, and it's in verse 5 of Ezekiel chapter 38, we want to remember that using Bible terminology and understanding it from the Bible language and Bible history point of view, Africa was really only divided up into 3 areas. The areas of Africa were and they're divided really and separated by the Sahara Desert, which is the world's biggest desert. And so to the north of the Sahara Desert, all that area is known as Libya in the Bible. It's originally one of the sons of Canaan, Phut, P-H-U-T, sometimes pronounced Put. So Phut or Put, and later it became known as the area of the Lubims. Now the Lubims in the Bible, it's in Daniel chapter 11, the word Libya is from the original language Lubims. You can see Libya, Lubims. Lubims means people of the parched area, the dry area. And that, of course, is so in most of the area across northern Africa. Then you've got Egypt, and Egypt was separate. It was the other son of Ham called Mizraim. And Egypt managed to take all the area of the Nile River, surrounding the Nile River. The Nile River is the only river which runs through the Sahara Desert. Okay, and it runs north, as we know, through the Sahara Desert. So Mizraim settled around that and controlled that area known as Egypt. All the rest of the people, the sons of Ham, were the sons of Cush, and they settled everywhere south of the Sahara. So we just think of Ethiopia perhaps as the old Abyssinia, which is on the Horn of Africa. No, Ethiopia is the whole of the area of South Africa. Libya is the whole of that northern fringe of Africa, and Egypt we know is around the Nile. So these are the countries that are mentioned. So when we're talking about Bible prophecy being fulfilled, it's all that area of Africa is with Russia in the last days. Egypt, of course, comes under Russian control, not voluntarily, it would appear, from Daniel chapter 11, but the other countries, it says in Daniel chapter 11, Libya and Ethiopia are at Russia's steps. Now this is happening now. He shall have power, Daniel 11 verse 43, that is the king of the north, that Russia coming down have power over the treasures of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now how important is Africa to Russia in its worldwide ambitions, particularly its ambitions in the Middle East? Well, historically, when these people started a fight, there were thousands of them. Thousands of them. They are known historically as aggressive people, willing to fight. They had huge armies. In fact, you can see some quotes there from 2nd Chronicles saying how many came out of Africa, many chariots, thousands of chariots, and hundreds of thousands of horsemen. Horsemen without number. As a matter of fact, in 2nd Chronicles 14, regarding King Asa of one of the kings of Israel, the Ethiopians came against him with 1 million soldiers, and God still saved his people Israel. So what does Putin want from Africa? Well, we'll talk about that and show just a brief video here. This area you can see underneath the Sahara Desert is called the Sahel. South of the Sahara Desert, this narrower band of semi-arid territory called the Sahel, which has a lot of the countries that are being mentioned in the news today. It's very dry in the northern part of it. There's a little bit of more growth possible further south you go, away from the Sahara Desert. But this Sahel fringe runs right across Africa. It's hard to grow food, but it's very, very rich in resources, such as the uranium, the gold that we've mentioned. And most of the inhabitants live there in poverty. That whole area has been exploited by European countries for centuries, and particularly France. And the French, of course, sent the French Foreign Legion down in there, took over the area, extracted all the resources, and didn't put much in by the way of infrastructure. But what infrastructure they did put in, they're now saying, well, we'll give you your independence, but we're going to tax you for all the resources we put in all those centuries ago, over the last few centuries. And we also want to control your economy. We want to hold your financial reserves. And that's what's going on. And the people, of course, are still in poverty. No wonder they're rising up against their masters. So France and other European countries are being ejected from Africa, and now Russia sees the gap. Russia wants their resources, and he wants their huge numbers of fighting men. And I read that Kalashnikovs, the Russian gun, the Kalashnikovs are their favourite guns. So, in the Sahel.
There is an undeclared war in the Sahel, involving not just locals, but Russia, France, China, and the United States. Right in the thick of it is Wagner, a private military company with ties to the Kremlin. The mercenaries have set up shops in Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic. They're aiding rebel forces in Chad and Sudan, while in Libya, they're curbing oil exports to Europe. Still more, in Ivory Coast, Wagner has set up a base for informational warfare, propagating disinformation across the continent. The result? French flags are burned, while Russian flags are hoisted. Wagner is estimated to have around 5,000 troops across Africa, and its contractors control strategic sites and mineral deposits while denying those same resources to geopolitical rivals. Wagner is laying down strong roots, so much so that it even considered creating a confederation of African states stretching from Guinea to Eritrea.
And we all heard of the Wagner group because their leader actually was marching against Moscow because he claimed they weren't being supported financially and with weapons sufficient to continue their mercenary activities in Ukraine. But in the meantime, they've sent many people into Africa, again to destabilise, and Mr Putin is funding all of that. So, as you saw there, the French flag is being burned, the people don't want France involved in Africa anymore, and they're very happy to put up the Russian flags. So Mr Putin, at his Russian-African summit in St Petersburg, is getting closer and closer to the leaders of Africa.